How's everyone who's watching this? This is my 85th video on my channel, and today we're starting yet another book, Authoring Autism by Remi Yergeau. As an autistic person myself, this is a book I've been wanting to look at for a while now. In it, Yergeau explores the complex relationship between rhetoric and autism, as well as how autism, and neurodivergence more generally, can be understood from a queer point of view. As we will see in the videos that follow this and the next, they cover everything, from how supposedly universal theories of autism are involved in denying autistic people our potential for rhetoric, to topics like disclosing being autistic, and how we interact with language. However, before we get into the book itself, I also wanted to mention that I've set up a Redbubble store with some channel merch, like this. The amazing Dialogue, who does much of the art for the channel, has been working with me to make some new designs. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Yergeau begins authoring autism by talking about shit, specifically their own. As they describe, the kinds of stories or narratives that their mother tends to wield vary radically from time to time. Sometimes, she speaks about how they were so well-behaved and quiet as a baby. Other times, in certain moods on certain days, this morphs into something quite different. The mother talks about finding them with shit smeared in their crib, then moves on and talks about their lack of friends at school, or their obsession with memorizing road maps. With each step in this particular narrative, as Yergeau describes, there is solemnity. Their mother implicitly recognizes something she feels she should have realized sooner: their autism. On a fundamental level, autism is a narrative condition. For Yergeau, diagnosed as an adult, it gave other people a way to retroactively weave a narrative out of their body and behaviors. Movements became stimming, their love of the electric light orchestra became a perseveration, so on and so on. As they themselves put it,
"My very being became a story, a text in dire need of professional analysis. This, my body, this was autism, and suddenly with a neuropsychologist's signature on my diagnostic papers, I was no longer my body's author."
when we are diagnosed as autistic, we are often placed in a bit of an odd position. We are slotted into a kind of story, where medical criteria are used to make sense of our body-minds, a term that specifically stresses the close relationship between the mental and the physical. Here, Yergeau is careful to draw a line between autistic and autism as modifiers. You might have heard of an autism mom, a generally non-autistic parent who constructs a specific kind of identity around having an autistic child, which often ends up being quite ableist or pathologizing. The use of autism here is storying, but in a different way than autistic. It has to do with a sort of tale, a discourse surrounding autism that often isn't guided by autistic people ourselves. Beyond autism moms, you have autism researchers, autism therapists, and autism specialists. They create a model of us based on contrast. Normal people deal with language in one way, we don't. Normal people are empathetic, we aren't. The essence of autism, at least in a lot of clinical literature, is identified by Yergeau as antithesis and enigma. Our condition, and ultimately us as beings, is perplexing. Turning back to Yergeau themselves, they offer shit-smearing as a particularly powerful narrative in this regard. It's one that a lot of autism parents focus on, but in a way that, to borrow our author's words, is shittier than the shit it claims to represent. This is because, whilst such stories are often about humanizing autism, giving a concrete face to an otherwise pretty abstract thing, the focus is solidly on those autism parents, not the autistic humans who are at the base of it all. Their voices don't matter, because narratives like this position them as victims to a messed up brain first and foremost. Even outside of shit, this kind of story permeates autism discourse pretty deeply. The child who refuses a hug, for example, is usually not the figure the audience is meant to feel for when reading a blog by an autism parent. Instead, it is the parent themselves who plays that role, There isn't much room for contextualizing the very much lived experiences of the child in question, and the why behind refusing a hug goes from one of rhetoric to one of neurology. We don't hug because of our mistaken neurons, strange synapses, and problematic gut flora. As Yergeau explains, autistic narratives by autistic people are often purposefully ignored. Summing everything up with a series of questions, they write,
To whom do we listen? The autistic or the non-autistic? Can there ever really be an in-between? What of my shit? What of my unhuggable body? What of me? What of autos, the self that so consumes the presumably autistic? Where the fuck are we?
There's a broad tendency to consider things as being much better now, to think that autistic stories will soon overtake autism ones. However, Yergeau is not so sure. They stress that they still believe in autistic futures, they aren't completely pessimistic, but also that autism is still understood today in largely ableist terms. Even now, we are often cast out of rhetoric, constructed as more symptom than person. For example, Yergeau is a rhetorician themselves, but as they relate, many therapists and even colleagues have told them that their autism makes the full truth of that impossible. In the context of rhetorical studies, this means a lot. For many in the field, to be rhetorical is essentially to be human, although at this point, specifying what rhetoric actually means is probably important. As we will see once we get into chapter 1, there are many ways to approach this particular topic. However, the general idea is that rhetoric concerns narratives and stories. These are often connected to sociality, understood as how we, in quotes, relate to each other and our surroundings. Citing theorist Craig Smith, Yergeau explains that rhetoric has to do with our very existence. It's ontological. The ways we learn, even the ways we live, are steeped in rhetoric. However, autism, as that which contrasts, is, more often than not, considered to signal where the rhetorical falls apart. Concluding the first section of the introduction, Yergeau states,
If clinical discourse on autism is storied around rhetorics of scientific sadness, then autistic rhetorics, in all of their contrastive resonances, queer the motifs, structures, modes, and commonplaces of what non-autistics have come to narrate and thereby know about autism.
With this, we get to the first proper subsection of the book, titled Voluntary Rhetorics. The main focus here is on how narratives around autism, and mental disabilities more generally, give more agency to conditions than to the people who experience them. As Yergeau explains, there's something almost surprising in their view that autism is profoundly rhetorical. There's a powerful tendency in a lot of autism research to write off our ability to create or enjoy stories. With numerous works in places like the influential Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders promoting the idea that autistic autobiography lacks coherence, awareness of others, or even basic self-reflection. These medical narratives of a lack of stories or rhetoric are basically the focus of Authoring Autism, with Yergeau explicitly trying to problematize the claim that we are, as they themselves put it, merely the residues of rhetoricity. The notion of the involuntary is pretty crucial here, manifesting in a number of ways. First, most obviously, autism isn't something you choose. It is something that happens, with groups like Autism Speaks even comparing it to car crashes and cancer. In the autism and not necessarily autistic world, a not too uncommon question is who would choose to have the condition. Second, and perhaps more insidiously, autism is often treated as something that robs people of their will entirely. Not only do we not choose our neurology, we don't choose to do anything. We are not agents in this world, but basically puppets of our deformed brains. Yergeau singles out a book titled The Ethics of Autism by Deborah Barnbaum as symptomatic of this position. In the work, Barnbaum portrays the autistic person as living an intrinsically limiting life, and the condition itself as cutting people off from people, paraphrasing the work. As our author summarizes the narrative here,
What Barnbaum and others suggest is that autism is a world without people, that a world without people is a world without rhetoric, and that an arhetorical life is a life not worth living, a life beyond the realm of voluntary action and intentionality.
This framing is fundamentally disingenuous. No one chooses their neurology, and being non-autistic is no less involuntary. Regardless, to quote from Yergeau again, autistics wrench and scream and rock their bodies, and they have no choice. They have no agency. This sort of narrative permeates every crevice of how autistic subjectivity is understood. Beyond rocking our bodies, how we carry ourselves socially and even our interests are treated as reducible to the poverty I brought up earlier. Nevertheless, for Yergeau, involuntarity is not intrinsic to autism. Whilst it is definitely a story through which many of us interact with the world, it is not some essence that structures the very core of our being. The story of involuntarity is one of abuse, disbelief, and pain, a tale forcibly imposed on autistic bodies by all kinds of institutions, often through violent means. To take from the text,
Involuntary logics are the logics that delivered me to the psychiatric ward of the local hospital. They are the logics that forcibly absented me from a high school education. They are the logics of overmedication, eugenic futures, institutionalization. Involuntarity wreaks violence, even when violence is wrought voluntarily.
for Yergeau, authoring autism is constructed around an interrogation along two main axes. The first is that of autism itself, specifically the way autism is frequently considered to stand in the way of the wills and intentions of those of us who are autistic. The second, in contrast, has to do with the coercive influences surrounding autism, specifically the therapeutic narratives pushed with things like applied behavioral analysis, or ABA for short. In such therapies, autistic people are rewarded for supposedly normal behaviors and, at least historically, punished for autistic ones. In other words, they are essentially molded to fit the expectations of those who are non-autistic, taking involuntarity from the biological level to the social. As a few theorists associated with behaviorism wondered, to what extent could autistic people's choices be said to be voluntary rather than conditioned responses? This question of conditioning leads us back to rhetoric. What even does autistic rhetoric look like? Earlier, Yergeau used the term residual. We are constructed as the residues of rhetoricity. For them, this means that something is left behind by mental disability, and that, because of this fact, mental disability takes over. Also, being a schizophrenic person, my actions might be theorized as biological rather than symbolic. Yergeau expresses this by saying that schizophrenia causes the person to act. I have no will, or if I do have a will, it is mediated by my mental disability. Autism is treated in the exact same way. Involuntarity dehumanizes people by constructing their selves as not really real. We go through the motions, but we aren't actual people, and we don't actually think or desire because we are outside of rhetoric. Yergeau phrases this in a syllogism. One must be human in order to be rhetorical. Autistic people are not rhetorical. Autistic people are not human, as they themselves tell it.
Ignore for a moment that an autistic person derived the above syllogism. The irony might cause a headache. Also ignore that an autistic person might know what irony is. Ignore too that rhetoricians have written about even the ways in which objects are rhetorical. Furniture may bear rhetoricity, but autistic people lack the Socratic gusto of futons.
Yergeau not only wants to interrogate how denying autistic people rhetoric takes away our agency, but also how it takes away our humanity. As we will see in later episodes in this series, ABA is not alone in storing autism like this. There's also theory of mind, a field that basically posits that autistic people lack the ability to truly understand that others have their own desires and thoughts, with proponents sometimes going as far as to say that we even lack an awareness of our own minds. Reality, for the theorist working from this basis, is out of our grasp. although the exact details will be the subject of another episode. Ending off this section, and thus the focus of this video, Yergeau writes,
Under such logics, I have written this book, presumably unaware of my reader and my non-self. The involuntary actions, thoughts, writings, and behaviors of my autistic body negate my claims to writerhood, rhetorichood, and narrativehood. Instead, this book might be better understood as a cluster of symptoms. Achoo! You're welcome.
It's on this note that we conclude the first few parts of Authoring Autism by Remi Yergeau, having explored how autism is often constructed as excluded from rhetoric, and as robbing those who are autistic from having any agency or even humanity. I know this has been a bit of a depressing video, but I still truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel like I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we will either be continuing with this book or returning to Science and Machines by Maurizio Lazzarato. Until then, bye.